When I was in college, I took a creative writing class that focused on poetry. And a couple weeks into the semester, I went to my professor with this burning question. And I sat down across from him, this wise, calm man who just exuded poeticness. I thought of him as the paradigmatic poet. I still often think of him as the paradigmatic poet. And I knew that he knew a secret knowledge that I needed to know myself. So I sat across from him, I looked into his eyes, and I said, "Tell me, Professor, what is poetry?" And he looked at me. If I remember correctly, he might have chuckled a little. He said, "Well, I'm not quite sure." And I was devastated. I thought, come on, man, you know what poetry is. You teach poetry. Here I am, an undergraduate at university. I'm supposed to learn the nature of things. Tell me what poetry is. And I thought maybe he was trying to trick me. Like, okay, he knows. He just wants me to work for it. And I think that there was an important part of that, right? A second week biology student who asked their professor, "So what is science in its essence?" The biology professor might want to say, "Well, why don't we take a little more time before we get to that gigantic principle?" And yet I think there really is a tendency, as we get further and further in the study of any subject, to hold lightly the giant definitions. Don Patterson, one of Scotland's greatest living poets, and I think one of the greatest poets of our age, he often talks about how asking what is poetry is kind of a category error. Because he says when people ask what is poetry, it's not the same thing as asking what is the sun or what is gravity. Poetry isn't some extra human object out in the cosmos for us to discover and study. Poetry is man-made. Poetry is a human art form, and so poetry is whatever we say it is. Poetry is what we make it to be. I think Patterson is half right about that. Because I remember another great writer who wrote a little before Don Patterson. His name was Aristotle. And Aristotle talks about poetry coming from something deep in our nature. And so in my definition of poetry, which I'm going to try and give you, and it's going to be very general, and I hope that you're not totally satisfied with it, because I'm not totally satisfied with it, and yet it's the best I think I can give you right now. I want to kind of combine the Aristotelian notion of poetry coming from something deep in our nature and Don Patterson's very, very valid point that poetry is what we make it. If I had to define poetry, I would say that poetry is an instinctual human craft that uses the patterns of human language to create works of art. So there are a couple parts to that definition. It's instinctual, I think. I think there's something about humans that we want to make art, and we want to make art with words. I think that's natural to us. Now, I have big thoughts about human ontology and what man is and what man's destiny is. We're going to set that aside for a minute. Because I think it's common to many religions, many worldviews, many cultures to think that there's a natural creativity within us. And so I think poetry really is instinctual. It's not wholly artificial in that we made it up one day and it's totally divorced from who we are deep down as humans. So I think it's instinctual. But I also do think Don Patterson's right. It really is a human craft. It's not unlike weaving or dance in that humans make it and we create traditions of it. And so I don't want to get distracted by very particular traditions, something like iambic pentameter. No, a poem doesn't need to be an iambic pentameter to be a poem. And yet it has to use the patterns of human language to create works of art. And I think this is very important because this is what distinguishes poetry from prose, I think. What distinguishes poetry from prose is that poetry prioritizes highlighting the extra grammatical patterns of language in its structure. It's not just structured based on sentences or clauses. A prose paragraph, a paragraph of a novel, say, it could be highly beautiful, and yet the patterning of the poem on the page, or the patterning of the piece of prose on the page, or even if it's read aloud, doesn't highlight the extra grammatical qualities of that prose passage. Whereas in poetry, we use lineation, we use verse. There are lines of verse. In many cultures, it's horizontal, but in some cultures, there are vertical lines of verse that are used. And those lineations highlight extra grammatical aesthetic patterns in our language and use those extra grammatical aesthetic patterns in relationship to the grammar to create sometimes highly complex works of art. So at its most basic, written poetry takes the form of words organized into horizontal or vertical lines, which are divided according to one or more aesthetic principles. This could be rhythm, this could be meter, it could be repeated grammatical structures, it could be the number of syllables, it could be a combination of many or all of these. These lines, in turn, are often organized into groups called stanzas, which often have their own structural qualities. Maybe you have 9 lines per stanza in a particular rhyme scheme or metrical pattern, or grammatical structure pattern that's repeated in the first 8 lines but varied up in the 9th line. Also, poetry doesn't need to be written, I think, to be an instinctual human craft that uses the patterns of human language to create works of art. When poetry is unwritten, when it's from an oral tradition, say early Anglo-Saxon literature or Hebrew literature or the Greek oral poetic traditions, you can tell by the rhythmic patterns of the spoken poetry where the aesthetic units are. Maybe it's dactylic hexameter, maybe it's the accentual syllabic alliterative verse of Anglo-Saxon, like Beowulf. So this is an approach to poetry, an approach to defining poetry that I think takes into account the many variations of poetry that we find across history and across cultures, and yet highlights that it's always going to be those patterns of language that are not merely grammatical, not merely for literal understanding of the spoken word, but highlight those aesthetic qualities of language that all languages have. Now, you might quibble and say, well, this doesn't take into account that poetry comes from an overflow of emotions. Well, I think that poetry, these works of art that poetry is, they highlight what's important in each culture. Maybe that is overflowing emotion, maybe a love song or a cry of lament. But maybe, like we find in the sonnet tradition often, it's the arguments, it's the logical progressions of thought that are important to the poet or important to the culture. Maybe it's a story holding up a hero or heroine as an example of ethical goodness that we want to highlight most in poetry. So I think we make these art forms to highlight what we most care about. Maybe that's sometimes simply a love song. Maybe it's a highly complex epic or argument. Maybe it's somewhere in between. So this is going to be my approach to defining and thinking about poetry. It's an instinctual human craft that uses the patterns of human language to create works of art.